everybody, welcome back to the show. My name is Jason Kishinev, and today we're going to start Chapter 6 of State of War. Gosh, I forgot the title for a second. State of War, A Secret History of the CIA and the Bush Administration. Hope you enjoy the episode. If you do, you know what to do. Hit that like and subscribe button. And hit the notification bell too for good measure. What the heck? Let's dig in. Chapter 6, Spinning War and Peace. The post-invasion period in Iraq proved to be far more difficult than anyone had hoped. Unfortunately, the Bush administration and the CIA were still so deeply politicized that the truth took a long time to sink in. The 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment of the United States Army has a long and proud history, a tradition dating back to the Indian Wars of the American West. Take a quick moment to plug the last book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States, which we read together. Talked a whole lot about how the Army tradition of killing Native Americans. First organized in the 1840s as the Regiment of Mounted Riflemen, it was renamed the 3rd United States Cavalry in the Civil War, the 3rd Cavalry Group mechanized in World War II, and finally the 3rd Armored. The regiment was born as a frontier unit, forged in the heat and dust of Texas, and it has been fighting native insurgencies in remote and godforsaken places since the days of Geronimo. By fall 2003, the 3rd Armored Cavalry, now equipped with Apache attack helicopters, and every time I'm hearing these Native American names like Apache helicopter, I'm remembering the last book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States, how they talk about, all the Native American names in the military tradition and equipment. Pretty sad. Time to move on. For the military to rename their stuff and their traditions and stop referring to enemy territory as Indian country. That's what I mean. Time to move on from that. By 2003, the 3rd Armored Cavalry, now equipped with Apache attack helicopters and Bradley fighting vehicles rather than horses and carbines, was in western Iraq trying to seal the porous Syrian border and prevent foreign jihadists from flooding in from around the Arab world. The regiment's 1st squadron was guarding the key border town of Qaim, about 200 miles northwest of Baghdad, and had settled into Tiger Forward Operating Base in an old train station on the outskirts of Qaim. In early November, the CIA's Baghdad station chief came to Tiger FOB as part of a tour of outlying U.S. military units in order to get a better feel for conditions around the increasingly restive country. In the Al-Qaim train station that day, a young commander said something foreboding to the CIA station chief that brought clarity out of the noise and confusion of the looting and violence that had marked the early months of the American occupation of Iraq. The Army officer looked at the CIA station chief and said, matter-of-factly, "The war is about to begin." The officer explained that over the last 4 to 6 weeks, something new had been happening in his area of responsibility. The Iraqi insurgents were coalescing, exhibiting in their tactics and methods greater command, control, and sophistication. The insurgents were getting better and more deadly. It was obvious to the officer that the rebels were gearing up for something bigger, and that the 3rd Armored Cavalry and the rest of the American Army was on the verge of a new war for Iraq. The officer's observations confirmed what the CIA station chief had begun to piece together himself from intelligence reports in his travels around Iraq. There had been intermittent attacks on American and international targets and a steady but still modest stream of casualties since U.S. troops entered Baghdad in April. Now the violence was evolving into something much worse. The relative quiet and broad popular support that the Americans had enjoyed in the first days of the occupation following the ouster of Saddam Hussein had proved to be a false dawn. Now the U.S. military was starting to face a well-armed guerrilla force with nearly unlimited resources, and the rebels were dedicated to throwing the Americans and their provisional government out of Iraq. The U.S. commanders in the field, like those with the 3rd Armored Cavalry, could sense it. It was coming at a faster pace every day, and it gave the CIA station chief a very bad feeling. The station chief returned to Baghdad, convinced that he had to issue a report to CIA headquarters offering a broad reassessment of conditions in Iraq. He had already written one assessment of the situation in August, but now things were getting much worse. The United States, he believed, was in danger of losing a war that it thought it had already won. That November, the CIA station chief wrote a painfully honest account of the worsening situation. It pulled no punches in detailing how the new insurgency was gaining strength from the political and economic vacuum that the United States had allowed to develop in Baghdad. He wrote his report in the form of an Aardwolf, a nickname for a CIA station chief's formal assessment of conditions in his country. The nickname came from an oddly striped type of African hyena and had stuck through generations of CIA officers. I never heard of it. There was only one problem. He had committed the unpardonable sin of telling the truth. The station chief's unvarnished warning of looming trouble in Iraq was a shot across the bow for the Bush administration. It couldn't go unanswered. He soon found himself facing piercing questions from CIA officials stemming from a series of inflammatory accusations about his personal behavior, all of which he flatly denied. Worse, in early 2004, the station chief began to sense that he was about to be turned into a scapegoat for the CIA's involvement in prisoner abuse at Abu Ghraib prison. He decided to quit the CIA in disgust. Later, he would trace his troubles back to his decision to write the unsparing truth about the growing insurgency and the failures of American policy to address the underlying problems that were fueling the war in Iraq. Former top CIA officials familiar with the matter deny that the station chief was removed from his post because of his critical Aardwolf report. They say instead that the Baghdad station had grown so large that the job had become too much for the young officer to handle. The station had a staff of 70 to 80 people in mid-summer 2003, but that figure surged to more than 300 by the end of 2003, and later grew further still, making it by far the largest CIA station in the world, and the largest since the agency's Saigon station at the height of the Vietnam War. There was so much going on, the former officials add, that the young station chief made serious mistakes, including his failure to monitor closely CIA interrogations at Abu Ghraib prison. The station chief was replaced with a more senior and more experienced officer. While those problems certainly did exist, it is also true that the station chief was not the only CIA officer to encounter career troubles after expressing skepticism about Iraq. In fact, while the pressures on the CIA from the Bush administration concerning the handling of pre-war intelligence have been well documented, it is now clear that such pressures continued long after the invasion. It became evident to officers in the field that intelligence reports raising questions about the conduct of the war and the problems being encountered in Baghdad because of the Bush administration's policies, or lack of policies, were not welcome in Washington. The sudden downfall experienced by the station chief following his candid report in November 2003 convinced other CIA officers that there was a steep price to be paid for writing unvarnished intelligence reports about Iraq. When I read that November Aardwolf, said a CIA official who knew the Baghdad station chief, I thought that he was committing career suicide. Certainly CIA officers stationed in Iraq learned to tread carefully. Sources say, for example, that they tried to avoid writing intelligence reports about Ahmed Chalabi, the former Iraqi exile who had close ties to the Pentagon's leadership. Reporting on Chalabi would only cause trouble. Many U.S. officials in Baghdad came to suspect that ragtag armed groups affiliated with Chalabi's camp were involved in looting and thievery in the chaos following the toppling of Saddam Hussein. But nothing was done about it, and no one wanted to report what they saw back to Washington. When Chalabi's supporters raced to seize many of the files of Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath Party and the former regime's intelligence service, neither the U.S. military nor the CIA intervened. CIA officials later said they suspected that Chalabi used the files against his political enemies. But CIA sources say that Chalabi's direct connection to Deputy Defense Secretary Paul Wolfowitz and other top Pentagon officials made him virtually untouchable. Chalabi remained in good standing with the Pentagon until the spring of 2004, when he was accused of revealing to Tehran that the United States had broken the communications codes of the Iranian intelligence service and that the Americans were reading Tehran's secret communications. Chalabi steadfastly denied any wrongdoing, maintaining that the charges were a CIA smear. This did lead to a break in relations with Chalabi, but only for a time. One of the greatest political survivors of modern times, Chalabi would later reinvent himself once more by aligning with radical Shiites like rogue cleric Muqtada al-Sadr in order to gain popular support in Iraq. In April 2005, he would be named one of two deputy prime ministers and interim oil minister. In November, he would be meeting in Washington with top administration officials, including Rice, Rumsfeld, and Cheney. As the insurgency worsened and the Bush administration fumbled for answers, the consequences to those who provided honest intelligence reporting became more obvious. In 2004, case officers stationed in Baghdad told their colleagues that they were frequently ordered to revise intelligence reports that were considered negative about Iraq. And in late 2004, when a new CIA station chief, the successor to the officer pulled in December 2003, wrote another Aardwolf reporting on the deadly conditions in Iraq, his political allegiances were quickly questioned by the White House. CIA officials later learned, after his Aardwolf circulated in Washington, Then U.S. Ambassador John Negroponte heard from an official at the National Security Council.
What?
The NSC wanted to know whether the CIA officer was a Republican or a Democrat. It's so messed up. It's so messed up, isn't it? But that's why we're reading this, and that's why I appreciate that you're joining me, because we all need to know this stuff. We all need to know this stuff. Recommend this show to your friends. They need to know too. The pressures extended even down to the level of CIA officers involved in the interrogation of captured Iraqi officials. According to CIA sources, most of the high-level members of Saddam Hussein's former regime who were captured by U.S. forces after the invasion provided little useful information. But one who did was Abid Hamid Mahmoud al-Tikriti. That's a mouthful. The presidential secretary to Saddam Hussein and dubbed the Ace of Diamonds in the U.S. military's famous deck of cards identifying the highest ranking members of the Iraqi regime. As one of Saddam's closest confidants, he had been in charge of Saddam's personal security and had controlled access to the Iraqi president. He was one of the few people who knew the innermost secrets of the bloody history of the Iraqi regime. After he was captured in June 2003, the CIA assigned one of its best Arabic speakers, a woman who fully understood the nuances of the language, to question the presidential secretary. But what the Iraqi told his interrogator did not fit with what Washington wanted to hear. He said, for instance, that Saddam Hussein had not been at Dora Farms, a compound outside Baghdad, when the United States launched a bombing raid against the site at the start of the war in an attempt to kill the Iraqi leader and quickly decapitate the regime. He wasn't there. Saying that Saddam was not at Dora Farms was inconvenient for Washington on several levels. A year before the war, the CIA had virtually no spies with inside knowledge of Saddam Hussein's regime. But just before the war, the agency's Iraqi operations group suddenly recruited an entire network of agents. This overnight network was dubbed the Rock Stars. They were paid huge sums of money in return for what they claimed was insider information. The Rock Stars might have seemed too good to be true, but for the CIA, which had not had any decent spies inside Iraq in years, the Rock Stars were too tempting to pass up. Just 2 days before the American invasion was scheduled to be launched, a Rock Stars agent reported that there was unusual activity at a compound known as Dora Farms outside Baghdad, and that it appeared that Saddam Hussein and possibly his two ruthless sons were staying there. CIA Director George Tenet rushed the information to the White House, and the president quickly ordered a strike by cruise missiles and stealth aircraft against the site in an attempt to kill Saddam and perhaps shorten the looming war. Saddam was not killed in the strike, but the CIA and the Bush administration invested heavily in the notion that the attack had nearly killed the Iraqi leader. For the CIA, and Tenet in particular, it would be difficult to acknowledge that the information had been wrong. In an interview, a former Iraq Operations Group officer said that the Rock Stars provided valuable intelligence and stressed that Saddam was at Dora Farms. Another awkward disclosure came when the presidential secretary said that Saddam fled Baghdad by driving through a U.S. military checkpoint without being recognized. I don't know if that's true or not. In addition, Abid Hamid Mahmoud al-Tikriti told his interrogator that Iraq had no weapons of mass destruction, that the weapons of mass destruction had all long since been destroyed. When he said this in June 2003, the United States was still conducting its post-war hunt for the banned weapons, and finding them was an important political objective for the Bush administration. Before the war, the CIA had concluded that Mahmoud al-Tikriti was one of the only top officials of the Iraqi regime who had release authority over the country's weapons of mass destruction, so he was believed to be one of the few who knew where they were hidden. What did it mean that he was telling his interrogator that there were no such weapons? Well, CIA headquarters decided that Mahmoud al-Tikriti was just lying, and that his female CIA interrogator was not pressing him hard enough. She had developed clientitis. Inflammation of the client? And was going too easy on the Iraqi. CIA headquarters complained she was too accepting of his lies. CIA officials ordered that she be replaced. It was part of a pattern. The people who were running things and the people who were getting promoted were politically responsive to the administration, said one CIA source. Still, the biggest problem facing U.S. intelligence officers in post-invasion Iraq was the same thing that plagued the U.S. military. The glaring fact that no one had developed a plan for what to do after American troops got to Baghdad. The White House had strangely left the job of post-war planning up to the Pentagon, cutting out the State Department, which had been studying the issue for a year and had put together detailed plans for reconstruction, but the Pentagon leadership had no serious interest in post-war planning. That'd be Rumsfeld, wouldn't it? They equated it with nation building, a term that had been discredited in the 1990s among conservatives who associated it with Clinton administration foreign policy. President Bush had campaigned against nation building during the 2000 presidential race, and Pentagon hardliners still opposed it. Even while the United States was invading and occupying 2 countries in 2 years, they argued that the U.S. military should fight and not dissipate its resources in rebuilding after combat. I would like to argue that there's something in between rebuilding a foreign government the way we want it and not doing anything. There's an in-between there. This author misses it. I'm a little disappointed. The White House had to know the consequences of the Pentagon's reticence about reconstruction well before the Iraq War, since Rumsfeld and other defense officials had earlier resisted such involvement in Afghanistan. After the quick military victory over the Taliban in the fall and winter of 2001, President Bush pledged in early 2002 that the United States would not allow Afghanistan to fall back into chaos. But inside... We'll read about Afghanistan another time. But inside the Bush administration, Rumsfeld and the Defense Department were initially reluctant to take responsibility for building a new Afghan army, which was needed to give backbone to the fragile new government in Kabul, according to former administration officials. When it came to Iraq, the Pentagon believed that it had the silver bullet it needed to avoid messy nation building. A provisional government in exile built around Chalabi could be established and then brought into Baghdad after the invasion. The exiles could step in and take over in a kind of turnkey operation. But President Bush vetoed that idea, repeatedly telling his top advisors that he did not want the new government of Iraq to be chosen in Washington. It had to be chosen by the Iraqi people. Several officials say that Bush personally made it clear just before the invasion that the United States would not set up Chalabi as the new leader of Iraq. Bush's commitment to democracy was laudable, but it was not really an answer to the question of post-war planning. Once Bush quashed the Pentagon's plans, the administration failed to develop any acceptable alternative. To be sure, the NSC staff led an interagency team that came up with policy guidelines to be used during the post-war period. The team's conclusions were briefed to President Bush and his senior advisors just before the invasion and included recommendations to keep the regular Iraqi army largely intact and to keep de-Baathification of the Iraqi government to a minimum. Both of those recommendations were ignored. Instead, once the Pentagon realized the president wasn't going to let them install Chalabi, the Pentagon leadership did virtually nothing. After Chalabi, there was no Plan B. Part of the reason the planning for post-Saddam Iraq was so non-existent was that the State Department had been saying if you invade, you have to plan for the post-war, recalled one former official in the Bush White House. And DOD said, no you don't. You can set up a provisional government in exile around Chalabi, and then the U.S. military could swiftly pull out. DOD, the Department of Defense, had a stupid plan, but they had a plan. But if you don't do that plan, and you don't make the Pentagon work with state to develop something else, then you go to war with no plan. Administration officials still argue that there was a plan for what they called Phase 4, or the post-invasion stage of Operation Iraqi Freedom. The plan called for the creation of an organization called the Office of Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance, ORHA, O-R-H-A, to be run by retired Army Lieutenant General J. Garner, who had been in charge of providing assistance to Kurdish refugees following the first Gulf War in 1991. But the Bush administration saw ORHA's mission as temporary, one designed to feed and house refugees and turn the lights on in Baghdad and help get the Iraqi infrastructure up and running until new Iraqi leadership emerged. No one figured out before the war how they were going to get from ORHA to a new Iraqi leadership. ORHA was soon replaced by a cumbersome new organization called the Coalition Provisional Authority, run by Paul Bremer, a former State Department official. The Pentagon continued to oversee the operation, and the CPA reported directly to the Defense Department. Soon Republican operatives and conservative ideologues flooded into Baghdad to work for the CPA. They sought to turn Iraq into a laboratory for conservative ideas that they had not yet been able to sell in the United States. Good God, man. But while they were fiddling with their pet projects, Baghdad was starting to burn. Officials at the White House and Pentagon convinced themselves that the lack of planning was in reality a visionary approach. In a highly revealing post-invasion interview with The Atlantic magazine, Undersecretary of Defense Doug Feith proudly acknowledged as much. "You will not find a single piece of paper," Feith told The Atlantic. "If anybody ever went through all of our records, and someday somebody will, presumably nobody will find a single piece of paper that says, 'Mr. Secretary or Mr. President, let us tell you what post-war Iraq is going to look like, and here is what we need plans for.' If you tried that, you would get thrown out of Rumsfeld's office so fast. If you ever went in there and said, 'Let me tell you what something's going to look like in the future,' you wouldn't get to your next sentence." The damaging effects of the lack of any serious planning might have been reduced if the U.S. military had gone into Iraq with many more troops, with enough force to lock down the entire country and prevent chaos until some kind of new government emerged. But Rumsfeld strongly opposed recommendations for more force from army leaders who believed the invasion was being planned with a dangerously small force. When Army Chief of Staff General Erich Shinseki told Congress in February 2003, just weeks before the invasion, that several 100,000 troops would be needed in post-war Iraq, both Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz publicly attacked him, since they had both been arguing that the war could be won with a much smaller force. The idea that the war might be a painful drain on the military was heresy. Shinseki was pushed aside. The message was not lost on other American military commanders. Don't complain about the resources available for the war in Iraq if you want to keep your job. Bush and Rumsfeld would later both claim that they were always prepared to send more troops to Iraq if commanders in the field requested them, but the generals had learned not to ask. At first, most Iraqis did welcome the Americans as liberators, just as Pentagon conservatives had predicted. As a result, the Bush administration was granted a brief grace period in which it could still have moved to bring stability to the country. Instead, the Pentagon and the CPA, encouraged by Chalabi, launched a damaging purge of Ba'ath Party members from key government positions in Iraq, and then compounded that action by quickly demobilizing the Iraqi army. Membership in Saddam's Ba'ath Party had been crucial to personal advancement in the old government, so de-Baathification removed most of the people who had been responsible for making the Iraqi government work. Disbanding the Iraqi army, meanwhile, sent hundreds of thousands of soldiers home without paychecks, converting them into natural recruits for a rebellion. Combined, the two actions convinced the Sunni elite, a minority that had been ruling Iraq for centuries, that the Americans were determined to overturn its traditional hold on power. The Bush administration was not going to stop at ousting Saddam Hussein. It was going to topple the existing class structure of Iraq. American policies were having the effect of ripping power away from the Sunni Muslims and handing it to Iraq's long-suffering Shiite majority, which was certain to come out on top in direct elections. This was social engineering on a historic scale, akin to Reconstruction in the post-Civil War American South, when Iraq's embittered Sunnis turned against the occupation. The United States had no effective response. The insurgency began to grow. The Bush administration initially dismissed the new insurgency as scattered acts of terrorism that did not represent a serious threat. Car bombings and guerrilla activity were said to be desperate acts of dead-enders who would wilt away once Saddam Hussein was captured. In fact, The insurgency was made up of a complex mix of forces, and it was sometimes difficult to determine whether they were working together or along parallel tracks. There were some foreign jihadists and Al Qaeda sympathizers, most notably the ruthless group led by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, a Jordanian-born terrorist. It was a sad irony that these jihadists were turning Iraq into a terrorist haven after the American invasion, not before it. Yet the number of foreign Arab fighters was small. The insurgency was dominated by former intelligence officers and other members of Saddam Hussein's regime. The CIA later determined that they had planned for guerrilla war before the U.S. invasion by setting up secret weapons caches and stay-behind networks. The CIA eventually discovered, for instance, that just before the war, Iraqi intelligence agents had purchased large numbers of garage door openers in Dubai as crude but effective remote triggering devices for roadside bombs. Wow. That's the stuff of movies right there. Thanks for joining me. Let's wrap that up right there. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Hit the like and subscribe button if you did. And hit the notification bell. Throw it in for good measure. YouTube, sometimes it unsubscribes people for watching shows that tell people the truth. So, once again, thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time.